Waitress stood up for an elderly biker. 500 bikers showed up for Payback. Maggie Carter had been working at Benny's Diner for nearly 20 years. At 38, she wasn't just another waitress, she was the heart of the place. She knew every regular by name, remembered their favorite orders, and always had a warm smile ready. For Maggie, the diner wasn't just a job. It was home. That afternoon, the weather was gloomy, with dark clouds rolling over the small town. Maggie was working her usual shift, wiping down the counter when she heard the low rumble of a motorcycle outside. She glanced up and smiled as Jack Hudson pulled into the parking lot. Jack was a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran who had been coming to Benny's every Thursday for as long as she could remember. His Harley-Davidson was old but well cared for, just like the man himself. He always sat in the same booth near the window, sipping coffee and eating a slice of apple pie, the way he had for decades. As Jack stepped inside, a group of teenagers from the nearby private school sat in a booth near the entrance. They were dressed in designer clothes, flashing their expensive watches, and laughing loudly. They had started coming to Benny's more often ever since the new owner, Travis Reed, had taken over. Unlike his father, who had built the diner into a beloved community spot, Travis only cared about attracting wealthier customers. Maggie could feel the shift in energy the moment Jack walked past their table. One of the teens nudged his friend and whispered something, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at that old guy," one of them sneered. "Bet he still thinks he's some tough biker." Another chuckled, shaking his head. "Should have left that motorcycle at the retirement home." A third leaned back in his seat, grinning. "Think he even remembers where he parked it?" The whole group burst into laughter. Maggie's smile faded. She looked at Jack, who kept his head down, pretending not to hear them. But Maggie knew better. Jack was tough, he had seen war, loss, and hardship, but no one deserved to be treated like that. Then, as Jack passed by their table, one of the teenagers stuck out his foot, trying to trip him. Everything happened in an instant. Jack stumbled, but before he could fall, Maggie lunged forward and steadied him. She turned sharply, her voice firm and unwavering. "That's enough," she said, glaring at the group. "Pack up your things and leave. We don't serve bullies here." The teens froze. They weren't used to being confronted. One of them scoffed, leaning back. "Do you know who my father is? He's on the city council." Maggie didn't flinch. "I don't care if your father's the president," she said. "You don't treat people like that in here. Not in Benny's Diner. Not ever." For a moment, there was silence. The other customers stopped eating, watching the scene unfold. The teenagers looked at each other, unsure of what to do. They had never been told no before. And then, Travis stormed out of his office. The diner fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The teenagers sat frozen, their smug expressions replaced with shock. Maggie stood tall, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. She had just kicked them out, the rich kids who thought they owned the world. She didn't regret a word of it. Then, from the back office, Travis Reed stormed in. His expensive suit looked out of place in a place like Benny's Diner, but everything about him screamed money over morals. He glanced at the teenagers, their arms crossed in defiance, and then turned to Maggie. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Maggie didn't back down. "They were harassing Jack," she said, motioning toward the elderly biker, who stood by his usual booth, gripping the back of the chair as if trying to contain his anger. "They mocked him. Tried to trip him. That's not okay." Travis folded his arms, his expression darkening. "You can't just throw out paying customers." Maggie clenched her fists. "I don't care how much money they have. This place has always been about respect. If you let them treat people like that, you're the one ruining this diner, not me." A tense silence hung in the air. A few of the regular customers nodded in agreement, murmuring under their breath. But Travis didn't care. He only saw dollar signs walking out the door. "Apologize," he ordered, his voice cold. Maggie stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Apologize to them," Travis repeated, motioning toward the teenagers, who now smirked, thinking they had one. "Tell them you were out of line, or you're out of a job." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. This place had been her home for nearly 2 decades. She had poured her heart into every shift, every customer, every cup of coffee. But in this moment, she realized something crystal clear. This wasn't Benny's diner anymore. Not the one she loved. Not the one Jack and the other regulars had called home for years. She took off her apron and folded it neatly, setting it on the counter. Then, she met Travis's gaze with calm defiance. "No." Travis's jaw tightened. "Then you're fired." Maggie didn't flinch. She turned to Jack and gave him a reassuring smile. "Guess I'll be finding a new diner," she said lightly, though her heart ached. As she walked toward the door, Jack followed her, shaking his head. "This ain't right," he muttered. Maggie took a deep breath, stepping outside into the cool evening air. The neon glow of the Benny's Diner sign reflected off the pavement. The place she had loved for years had just turned its back on her. But she wasn't alone. Jack reached into his pocket, pulled out an old flip phone, and started dialing. His expression was unreadable, but his grip was firm. "What are you doing?" Maggie asked. Jack looked at her and simply said, "Calling family." Maggie walked out of Benny's Diner with her head held high. She refused to let Travis Reed see even a hint of defeat on her face. He had fired her for doing the right thing, for standing up to a group of spoiled teenagers who thought their wealth gave them the right to humiliate others. If that was the price of integrity, she was willing to pay it. Jack Hudson followed her outside, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "This ain't right," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've been the heart of this place for years, Maggie. And that kid throws you out like you're nothing?" Maggie sighed, forcing a small smile. "It's just a job, Jack. I'll find another." Jack didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out an old flip phone from his leather jacket and started dialing. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who had seen real battles, not just in war, but in life. He wasn't calling just anyone. He was calling his brothers. Within minutes, word spread like wildfire. Jack wasn't just an old biker. He was a legend. Decades ago, he had co-founded the Patriot Riders Motorcycle Club, one of the largest and most respected biker groups in the state. They weren't a gang. They were veterans, mechanics, business owners, people who believed in loyalty, respect, and standing up for their own. And Maggie? Maggie was family. By the time Jack finished making his calls, customers inside Benny's diner had already begun texting, posting, and spreading the story online. People were outraged. Maggie wasn't just another employee, she had been there for everyone. She had stayed late to help cook when the kitchen was short-staffed. She had covered shifts for single parents who couldn't find babysitters. She had even paid for a struggling customer's meal out of her own pocket more times than she could count. And now, she had been fired for standing up for what was right. 2 hours later, the ground started to shake. At first, Travis didn't notice. He was too busy trying to smooth things over with the teenagers, assuring them that they were still welcome. But then, he heard it. Engines. Deep, rumbling, thunderous engines. The noise grew louder. Plates rattled on the tables. Customers rushed to the windows. Outside, the street filled with motorcycles, lined up as far as the eye could see. Riders in leather jackets, vests covered in patches, some young, some old, but all of them there for one reason. For Maggie. Jack led the pack, stepping into the diner like he owned the place. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "We need to talk," he said. Travis swallowed hard, his usual smug confidence crumbling. For the first time since he took over the diner, he realized he wasn't in charge anymore. Travis Reed froze behind the counter. The sound of over 500 motorcycles still rumbled in the streets outside, a constant reminder that he had made a huge mistake. The customers inside Benny's diner sat in stunned silence, watching as Jack Hudson and a wave of leather-clad bikers filled the restaurant. The air was thick with tension. Jack stepped forward, his boots echoing against the tile floor. His expression was calm, but his presence alone was enough to send a chill down Travis's spine. Behind him, dozens of bikers stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked on the man who had just fired one of their own. Travis forced a nervous chuckle. "Listen, fellas, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Lisa Morgan interrupted, stepping beside Jack. Lisa was in her early 50s, tall and strong, with a confidence that came from years of leadership. She was the current president of the Patriot Riders, and when she spoke, people listened. "We heard what happened," she continued. "You fired Maggie for standing up to a bunch of entitled kids. That's not just wrong, it's disgraceful." Travis cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Look, it was just a business decision. I need paying customers, not..." Lisa held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Don't finish that sentence." She pulled a folded document from her jacket and placed it on the counter. "Because as of 20 minutes ago, this diner no longer belongs to you." Travis's face went pale. "What?" Lisa smirked. "Your father, the actual owner of this diner, has been trying to sell it for months. We made him an offer he couldn't refuse." She leaned in slightly. "Let's just say, unlike you, he understands the value of respect." Maggie, who had been standing near the door, gasped. "Wait, what?" Lisa turned to her with a warm smile. "We couldn't let this place fall apart, Maggie. This diner means something to this town. It means something to us." She looked back at Travis, her expression turning serious again. "And our first official act as owners?" She let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "We're firing you." The entire diner erupted into cheers. Customers clapped, bikers laughed, and for the first time that day, Travis had nothing to say. Jack grinned and turned to Maggie. The second act? He pulled a fresh manager's badge from his pocket and handed it to her. We're putting Maggie in charge. Maggie's eyes widened. I don't know what to say. Lisa patted her shoulder. Say yes. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, but she nodded. Yes. Outside, the roar of 500 motorcycles sounded again, not in anger this time, but in celebration.